Welcome to Cipher Trail, where every tale begins with a whisper and ends with the truth few dare to face. Tonight, we step into the world of Sherlock Holmes in a mystery known as the Case of the Vanished Heiress. An empty carriage arrives at a London station, its velvet seats still warm. A single pearl earring lies on the floor, glinting like a silent witness. But what force could make an heiress disappear without a sound and without a trace? What's your favorite era for a good mystery? If you're ready for another case, show your support and become part of our mystery-loving community. Now, pour yourself something warm, draw the curtains close, and let the mystery begin. It was a foggy evening in late October when a desperate knock echoed through the door of 221B Baker Street. Dr. John Watson, who had just returned from a long day of rounds, was the first to respond. He found a young man standing in the doorway, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. The man, wearing an expensive suit that seemed a size too large, had clearly been running. His breath came in short, frantic bursts. "Doctor Watson?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Yes, indeed. How may I help you, sir?" "I must speak with Mr. Sherlock Holmes," the man gasped, barely able to stand still. "It is a matter of life and death. I'm afraid for my sister." Watson ushered the man inside, gesturing for him to take a seat by the fire. His hands shook as he removed his gloves, and his eyes kept darting to the window as though expecting something or someone to appear from the thick fog outside. In moments, Holmes emerged from his study. As always, he was impeccably dressed, his face sharp and his eyes keenly observant. He eyed the man with the precision of a hawk, noting his nervousness, his disheveled appearance, and the small bead of perspiration running down his temple despite the cold room. "I am Sherlock Holmes," he said coolly, "and this is my associate, Dr. Watson. Now what is the matter?" The man took a deep breath, steadying himself as he sat on the edge of the armchair. "My name is Edward Kingsley. My sister Margaret has gone missing. No one can find her. I don't know what to do." Holmes leaned forward slightly, folding his hands together as his eyes narrowed, intrigued. "A missing person, you say? I assume she was not simply out for an evening stroll." Edward shook his head vigorously. "No, Mr. Holmes. Margaret would never do that. She has never once failed to return home, and I fear something terrible has happened to her." Watson glanced at Holmes, who seemed unbothered by the gravity of the situation. Holmes's demeanor was always one of calm precision, a trait that both reassured and bewildered Watson in equal measure. "Please continue, Mr. Kingsley," Holmes urged. "Tell us more about your sister's disappearance." Edward hesitated, then began recounting the events of the previous evening. Margaret was out at a dinner party at the house of Lord Pemberton, you see. She had been invited to celebrate the engagement of his daughter, Lady Cecilia. The party was rather small, but she promised me she would return by 10 o'clock. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Did she keep that promise?" "No, she did not," Edward replied, shifting in his seat. "By 11 o'clock I began to grow concerned, and I went to the Pemberton house. There I was told she had left just before 10, after a brief exchange with Lady Cecilia. But when I went to our family's estate, I found no trace of her. Her room was undisturbed, and the servants said they had not seen her since dinner. She vanished without a word." Holmes leaned back, his fingers tapping together in a slow rhythm. "Strange," he murmured. "The lady's disappearance seems to have been planned, yet no one saw anything suspicious. It is not often that a person vanishes without leaving a trace. Does she have any enemies?" Edward seemed to ponder the question for a moment. "Not that I know of. Margaret is well liked in society. She is kind, intelligent." He paused, his eyes flicking nervously toward the door. "But there is one thing, Mr. Holmes. One thing I fear could be the key to her disappearance." Holmes raised his head, his interest piqued. "Go on." Edward took a deep breath and leaned forward, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "My sister was to marry Lord Pemberton's son, Charles. within the next few months, but there have been rumors, dark rumors, Mr. Holmes. Charles has not been seen in weeks. Some say he is involved in dangerous business. Others whisper that he has also disappeared. I do not know if the two events are related, but I have my suspicions. Holmes's expression softened for a moment, his mind already racing through the possible connections. I see. You suspect that your sister's disappearance may be connected to this engagement, or rather, the mysterious absence of her fiancé. Exactly, Edward said, his voice thick with anxiety. I fear that whatever business Charles is involved in, it has something to do with her. I can't imagine that she would simply leave without a word. Holmes stood, his sharp eyes still fixed on Edward. Very well, Mr. Kingsley. I shall take the case. Watson and I will go to the Pemberton estate at once. We will uncover what we can about your sister's whereabouts, and I will find out if these rumors about Lord Pemberton's son have any merit. Edward breathed a sigh of relief. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I knew I could count on you. With a nod of affirmation, Holmes turned to Watson. Pack your things, Watson. We have a mystery to solve. As Watson prepared to leave the room, his mind whirring with the details of the case, Holmes stood still for a moment longer, his eyes narrowing as he gazed out into the foggy night. There was something about this case that felt different. Darker. Watson felt a sudden surge of excitement. Charles, are you certain? Holmes nodded. Quite. The handwriting matches the correspondence we've seen at the estate. But what is more intriguing is this entry, he continued, turning the pages to reveal a specific passage. It appears that Charles had suspicions about someone close to him, someone he trusted. Watson leaned in to read the entry. It was dated just a few days before Charles's disappearance. I have seen too much, heard too much. The web is tightening around me. Margaret does not know, but I fear for her safety. Lord Pemberton is involved in things I do not fully understand, and I cannot allow her to be dragged into it. I must leave before it is too late. Watson's brow furrowed as he absorbed the words. This is quite troubling. It seems that Charles suspected his own father. Holmes didn't respond immediately. He was already lost in thought, piecing together the implications of the journal entry. The mention of Margaret's safety was troubling, and yet the entry seemed to suggest that Charles had been trying to protect her from something, or someone. But who? Holmes, Watson pressed, do you think this journal will help us locate Charles? Holmes's eyes gleamed with an intensity that Watson had come to recognize as a precursor to a brilliant deduction. Possibly, but it is more likely that it will help us understand why he vanished in the first place. He closed the journal and placed it carefully on the desk before moving to the window. The mist outside had thickened, and the world beyond seemed muffled, as though the cabin itself were suspended in time. Holmes's gaze swept across the surrounding landscape, noting every detail, the dense trees, the distant hills, and the faint outline of a path leading deeper into the woods. I have a theory, Watson, Holmes said, his voice low and thoughtful. Charles Pemberton's disappearance is not merely a flight from family or an escape from some imagined danger. It is a carefully planned act. He did not leave of his own volition. Watson looked up sharply. You believe he was forced to disappear? Holmes turned to face him, his eyes narrowing with certainty. Yes. Someone has orchestrated this, and it is likely someone within the Pemberton family itself. I believe Charles stumbled upon something he should not have. Perhaps he uncovered secrets about his father's dealings, secrets that would have destroyed the Pemberton family's reputation. And in trying to protect Margaret, he was forced to disappear. Watson took a deep breath, the weight of Holmes's words settling over him. It was a chilling thought, but it made sense. If Charles had uncovered something incriminating, something that could have ruined his father's standing, it was entirely plausible that Lord Pemberton, or someone close to him, would have taken drastic measures to silence him. I think we need to look deeper into Lord Pemberton's business dealings. Watson suggested, his mind racing with the possibilities. Holmes's lips curled into a small, enigmatic smile. I agree. But before we do that, there is one more thing to examine here. He turned toward the chest in the corner of the room, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of a new puzzle to solve. Watson followed him, and together they approached the locked chest. Holmes knelt down and examined the lock closely, his fingers brushing over the iron clasp. "This is no ordinary lock," he muttered. "It is a complicated mechanism, designed to keep out all but the most determined." Holmes stood and glanced toward Watson. "Fetch me the tools from my bag. We'll see what secrets this chest holds." Watson nodded and hurried to retrieve Holmes's tools, his mind racing. If there was something hidden in that chest, something that Charles had left behind, it could be the key to unlocking the mystery of his disappearance and Margaret's involvement. As Holmes worked, the tension in the room grew. Every minute felt like an eternity, and Watson couldn't help but wonder what they would uncover when the chest was finally opened. Would they find proof of Charles's suspicions, or was the answer to this mystery more dangerous than either of them could imagine? The game was most certainly afoot. The lock on the chest was a puzzle in itself. Sherlock Holmes worked with a calm precision that Watson had come to expect, his long fingers delicately handling the small tools from his bag. He was methodical, each movement deliberate, his concentration absolute. Watson stood at a respectful distance, watching with bated breath as Holmes worked his magic. The chest itself was an antique, probably passed down through generations of the Pemberton family. Its wood was polished and rich with age, but its lock had clearly been designed to withstand the test of time. Holmes's face remained impassive, but there was a glint of satisfaction in his eyes as the mechanism clicked, finally giving way with a soft, reluctant groan. "Got it," Holmes murmured, his voice barely audible. He lifted the lid slowly, revealing the contents inside. It was not what Watson had expected. Instead of valuable documents or hidden treasures, the chest contained a collection of items that seemed oddly personal. Several old, tarnished pocket watches, a few faded letters bound with string, and a bundle of photographs. The photographs were the most intriguing. They were taken in various locations, some of them depicting members of the Pemberton family, while others showed strangers, people whose identities were not immediately clear. Holmes gingerly lifted the stack of photographs and examined them one by one, his brow furrowing slightly with each new image. The photographs were of varying quality, some slightly blurred, others clear and sharp, but all contained one common thread. They featured Charles, the new information they had uncovered. Watson, as always, was eager to engage with his friend, but he knew better than to press when Holmes was deep in thought. Instead, he allowed the silence to stretch, content to observe the master detective at work. The streets of London, bustling as ever despite the late hour, seemed to take on a different character in the fog. The shadows grew longer, the sounds muffled, and the world felt more mysterious, more uncertain. For Watson, it was as though they had stepped into another time, one where secrets were hidden just beneath the surface, and every corner might conceal something sinister. The carriage eventually stopped in front of a nondescript building on a narrow side street. Holmes turned to Watson, his expression unchanged, yet there was a certain intensity in his eyes. "This is it, Watson," Holmes said quietly as he climbed out of the carriage. "Edward Blackwood's office." Watson followed Holmes through the doorway, his heart quickening with anticipation. The office, as Holmes had described it, was small and unremarkable, tucked away in one of London's quieter districts. The sign above the door read, "Blackwood and Associates," though there was no indication as to what kind of business they might be involved in. The scent of old paper and ink lingered in the air, and the only sound was the faint ticking of a clock in the corner. Holmes wasted no time. He moved directly to the desk, his sharp eyes scanning the room with the efficiency of a man who was already 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Watson, as always, was playing catch-up, trying to follow the trail of logic that his friend left in his wake. The office was sparsely furnished. Just a desk, a few chairs, and a filing cabinet in the corner. Holmes opened the filing cabinet and began sifting through the papers inside, his fingers moving quickly but with an apparent understanding of what he was looking for. Watson hovered nearby, his mind racing with questions. "Holmes, what exactly are we hoping to find here?" Watson asked, unable to contain his curiosity. Holmes didn't look up from the filing cabinet, but his voice was calm and steady. "We are looking for any trace of Charles Pemberton's dealings with Blackwood. A letter, a contract, anything that might indicate the nature of their relationship. We know that Charles was involved in something illegal. Perhaps Blackwood was his partner in crime, or perhaps he was the one who drew Charles into it." Watson nodded, understanding now the depth of the situation. Charles's disappearance was not just the result of a family squabble or a simple romantic affair. No, this was more complicated, something dangerous. Holmes paused in his search, pulling out a manila folder and opening it with a deliberate motion. Inside were several sheets of paper, each covered with Blackwood's neat handwriting. The first letter Holmes skimmed through was addressed to a man named James Renwick, a name Watson did not recognize. "This is interesting," Holmes murmured. "It seems that Blackwood has connections to more than just the Pemberton family." Watson leaned in to read the letter as Holmes spoke. "Renwick, I trust the shipment arrived safely. The Pembertons are still unaware of our true intentions. Keep an eye on the boy. We do not want him causing any more trouble than necessary. If he grows suspicious, we must act quickly. The time is approaching, and we cannot afford any mistakes." Watson felt a chill as he processed the contents of the letter. This certainly implies that Charles was more than just a bystander in whatever scheme Blackwood was involved in. Holmes nodded, his expression grave. "It suggests that Charles was being manipulated, or perhaps used by Blackwood. This was no simple business venture. This was something far more illicit, far more dangerous." Holmes continued to sift through the papers, each letter offering more insight into the web of deceit that surrounded Charles's disappearance. There were mentions of shipments, of plans that had to be carried out in secret, and of people who would go to great lengths to ensure that nothing could disrupt their operation. The words painted a picture of a criminal enterprise, one that had ensnared Charles, and now, perhaps, his family. Watson's mind was racing. But why Holmes? Why would Blackwood and his associates want Charles to disappear? Surely they could have just silenced him. "That is the question, Watson," Holmes replied, his voice quiet but certain. "We are not dealing with simple criminals here. Blackwood and his associates are playing a far larger game. Charles's disappearance was not just about silencing him. It was about sending a message to the Pembertons, to anyone who might cross them." Holmes stood, his fingers lightly tracing the edges of the papers. "But there is more to this than simply a message. I believe that Charles discovered something that would have destroyed this entire operation. That is why he had to be removed, and why his disappearance had to appear voluntary. But the question remains," Watson said. "How does Margaret fit into all of this?" Holmes's eyes flashed with the same sharp intensity that had become familiar to Watson over the years. "Ah, Margaret. I believe her disappearance is not as innocent as it seems. She may not have been directly involved in the operation, but she was close to Charles. She may have uncovered something herself. Her disappearance may be the key to understanding what truly happened to her brother." There was a long pause as the weight of Holmes's words settled between them. Watson was silent, flipping the possibilities in his mind, each more troubling than the last. Holmes turned abruptly, his gaze fixing on Watson. "We are close now, Watson. We have only one more piece of the puzzle to find. Edward Blackwood, himself." Watson nodded, his heart beating faster now with the realization that they were drawing ever closer to the truth. "And where do we find him?" Holmes's lips curled into a slight smile. We go to his home, of course. There are questions that only he can answer." As they left the office, Watson felt a sense of foreboding creeping over him. They were getting closer, but with every answer, more questions seemed to emerge. The shadows that had once felt distant were now closing in, and Holmes's brilliant mind was the only thing standing between them and the dangerous truths that lurked in the dark corners of London. The game, it seemed, was far from over. The streets of London seemed to close in on them as Holmes and Watson made their way through the foggy evening. The mist hung heavy in the air, casting the city in an eerie, almost dreamlike haze. The city, which had once been full of life and noise, now felt distant, as though its very soul had been obscured by the thick cloud of secrecy and danger that surrounded the case. Holmes's steps were deliberate and steady, each one taking them closer to the next part of their investigation. Watson, ever the loyal companion, walked beside him, his mind racing through the various twists and turns that had marked their progress so far. It had been days since Margaret Kingsley's disappearance had first been reported, and every clue they uncovered only seemed to deepen the mystery. The Pembertons, Edward Blackwood and Charles. Each thread they tugged at seemed to unravel another layer of deceit. Holmes had been unusually quiet since their visit to Blackwood's office, and Watson could sense that his mind was working at full speed, processing the information they had uncovered. There was something unsettling about the way Holmes had been piecing together the puzzle, an urgency in his actions that Watson had never seen before. As they approached Blackwood's estate, a sprawling manor situated on the outskirts of London, the fog seemed to thicken around them, as though the very air was conspiring to hide the truth. The estate loomed before them, its stone walls and ivy-covered facade creating an imposing, almost foreboding presence. It was a place of wealth, power, and secrets that Holmes was determined to uncover. "We're close now, Watson," Holmes said, his voice low but filled with purpose. "Everything we've learned points to Blackwood's involvement in this matter. If he is the key to unlocking the truth, then we must confront him." Watson nodded, his heart beating a little faster at the thought of confronting the man who might hold the answers they so desperately sought. Blackwood was an enigma, someone whose actions seemed to defy explanation. And yet, as Holmes had so often demonstrated, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, and the truth was within reach. The heavy iron gates of Blackwood's estate creaked open as Holmes and, "To answer any questions you have, but I must warn you my involvement with him was strictly business." Holmes regarded him for a moment, his gaze never wavering. "Business? Or something more, Mr. Blackwood? The letters we found suggest a far more complicated arrangement than simple business dealings." Blackwood's lips tightened, but he said nothing. Holmes continued, his voice cool and measured. "You see, Mr. Blackwood, the evidence we've uncovered points to a far darker web of deceit. You and Charles were involved in something that went beyond mere trade. Something that, I believe, could have had catastrophic consequences for both the Pemberton family and, indeed, the very people you associate with." Blackwood's eyes flickered again, and for the first time, Holmes saw a crack in his otherwise composed facade. "You've made quite an interesting leap in logic, Mr. Holmes," Blackwood said, his voice growing colder. "But I assure you, your conclusions are misplaced. I have nothing to hide." Holmes's eyes narrowed, and Watson felt a sense of tension building in the room. The atmosphere was charged, and Watson could sense that they were standing on the edge of a revelation, one that would either confirm their suspicions or cast the entire case into uncertainty. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I think, Mr. Blackwood, that you are hiding more than you realize." And with that, the game was set to shift once more. The silence in Blackwood's study stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Sherlock Holmes stood motionless, his sharp gaze fixed on Edward Blackwood, who was seated at his desk. For a moment, neither spoke, the tension between them palpable. Watson shifted uncomfortably, sensing the unease that had suddenly taken root in the room. The game was shifting, and they were now far closer to the heart of the mystery than they had been when they first arrived. Holmes, ever composed, broke the silence. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of unspoken knowledge. "You know, Mr. Blackwood, there are few things more dangerous than a man who believes he has nothing more to lose. Charles Pemberton was that man, and his disappearance was not the result of a simple escape, as you would have us believe." Blackwood's expression remained unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in his posture. He leaned back in his chair, clasping his hands together as if to maintain control of the conversation. "And you believe, Mr. Holmes, that I am somehow responsible for his vanishing?" His voice was steady, but there was an underlying tension in the words that betrayed his carefully constructed facade. "I believe you are more than just responsible," Holmes replied, his voice measured but firm. "I believe you orchestrated it. Charles stumbled upon something he should not have, something you were involved in. And now you've made sure that the truth remains buried, no matter the cost." Glow across the room as Watson sat down to gather his thoughts. Holmes, however, did not seem in the mood for rest. He paced the room, his mind clearly racing with deductions, his eyes occasionally flicking to Watson as if he were silently asking for his input. Watson cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Holmes, what's our next step?" Blackwood's reaction wasn't just defensive. "He's hiding something, something much bigger than we've anticipated." "But what?" Holmes paused mid-step, his penetrating gaze fixed on Watson. "That, Watson, is the question. Blackwood's behavior confirms that he is involved in something far more complex than mere business dealings with Charles. The nature of that involvement remains unclear, but it is undoubtedly the key to understanding why Charles disappeared and why Margaret is now missing as well." Watson frowned, his mind still circling the tangled web of clues. "But how do we prove it? Blackwood won't admit anything, and now that we've seen how far he'll go to cover up the truth, I'm afraid we're no closer to uncovering what really happened to them." Holmes's eyes gleamed with a sudden, sharp clarity. "We are closer than you think, Watson. Blackwood may have tried to mislead us, but he left something behind, something he wasn't counting on us finding." Watson raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Holmes walked over to the desk, where he had spread out the various letters, photographs, and documents they had found during their investigation. He began to sift through the papers with methodical precision, his fingers lingering over a particular letter that had caught his attention earlier. It was a brief communication from Blackwood to an unknown recipient, marked with a seal that had not yet been identified. Holmes's eyes scanned the letter, his mind clearly racing as he read between the lines. "This letter, Watson," Holmes said, holding it up for his companion to see, "is the key to understanding Blackwood's true role in this. Look at the date, just days before Charles disappeared. And the name in the signature. That is where the answer lies." Watson took the letter from Holmes and studied it carefully. The words were cryptic, but Holmes's analysis of the tone and the subtle details was enough to convince Watson that they were onto something. There was a name in the letter, one that had not come up in any of their previous inquiries. "Do you recognize this name?" Watson asked, pointing to the signature. "Reginald Thorne." Holmes nodded slowly, his brow furrowing. "Reginald Thorne. He is a name I've come across in my earlier investigations, though not in connection with this case. Thorne is a man with ties to the criminal underworld. Someone with the kind of connections that Blackwood would not hesitate to call upon in times of need. This is the man behind the operation." Watson's heart skipped a beat. So, Thorne is the true mastermind behind all of this? "Not the mastermind," Holmes corrected, his tone calm but firm. "But certainly the man who would have the means, the resources, and the motivation to force Charles into silence. If Charles had discovered something about Thorne's dealings, something that could have brought the entire operation down, then Blackwood would have been left with no choice but to make sure he disappeared." Watson's mind raced. "And Margaret?" Holmes paused, his fingers lightly tapping the desk as if considering something. Margaret is a different matter. I believe her disappearance was not simply a result of Charles's involvement in Thorne's world. I suspect that she knows more than she has let on, perhaps even more than Charles did. She may have discovered the truth about what happened to her brother, and now she is being kept out of sight for her own protection, or, more likely, because she is a liability. "But how do we find her, Holmes?" Watson asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "We've uncovered so much, yet we are no closer to finding her." Holmes's gaze softened, and he walked over to the window, looking out into the foggy streets of London. "We are closer than you think, Watson. The pieces are falling into place, and now we must act swiftly before Blackwood and Thorne have a chance to cover their tracks completely. We will begin by locating Reginald Thorne. If we can find him, we will find the answers we seek." The weight of Holmes's words settled heavily on Watson's shoulders. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, but with each revelation, the danger grew. Blackwood and Thorne were powerful men, and they would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. But Holmes was not a man to be intimidated, and Watson had come to trust his instincts completely. "We must move quickly," Holmes said, his voice low and determined. "If Thorne is the key to everything, then we must find him before he has a chance to vanish like Charles and Margaret. And we must be prepared for whatever he may be hiding." Watson nodded, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the final confrontation was fast approaching. There was no turning back now. The truth, whatever it may be, was waiting to be uncovered, and Holmes would stop at nothing to expose it. As Holmes turned away from the window and gathered his things, Watson followed, his mind focused on the task ahead. They were close, so close, and the danger was only just beginning to unfold. The shadows of London seemed to stretch out before them, but Sherlock Holmes was ready to face whatever darkness lay ahead. The truth was out there, and they would find it, no matter the cost. The streets of London seemed more foreboding than ever as Holmes and Watson made their way through the fog toward their next destination. The night had grown colder, the mist swirling around them like a thick, impenetrable curtain. Holmes walked with something dangerous, and the thought of what might be inside the warehouse sent a chill down his spine. "Almost there," Holmes murmured, his concentration unwavering. After what felt like an eternity, the lock clicked open, and the door creaked slowly as Holmes pushed it ajar. The darkness inside was suffocating, but Holmes didn't hesitate. He stepped into the warehouse, his every sense alert as he moved deeper into the shadows. Watson followed closely behind, his hand instinctively reaching for the revolver at his side. The interior of the warehouse was vast and cavernous, filled with crates and barrels stacked high, their contents hidden beneath layers of dust and cobwebs. The air was thick with the scent of salt water and old wood, and the faint sound of creaking timbers echoed through the space. Holmes moved swiftly, his eyes scanning the room with methodical precision. He knew that this was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment when everything would finally come to light. They reached the back of the warehouse, where a large set of double doors stood slightly ajar. Holmes paused, his hand resting on the door handle, his ear pressed against the wood as he listened for any sound on the other side. "Thorne is in there," Holmes said softly, his voice barely audible. "Stay close, Watson." Watson's pulse quickened as he nodded in agreement. The final confrontation was imminent, and he knew that once they entered that room, there would be no turning back. Holmes pushed the door open with a slow, deliberate motion, and they entered the room. The space was dimly lit, with a single lantern casting a faint glow over the cluttered interior. A desk sat in the center of the room, papers and maps strewn across its surface. The walls were lined with shelves filled with bottles and jars, their contents unknown. And sitting at the desk, his back to them, was Reginald Thorne. The man didn't appear to be surprised by their arrival. He remained motionless, his fingers tapping absent-mindedly on the desk as if he had been expecting them all along. "Well, well," Thorne's voice broke the silence, smooth and cold. I was wondering when you two would show up." Holmes and Watson exchanged a brief glance before stepping further into the room, their movements deliberate. Thorne finally turned to face them, his expression inscrutable. His sharp features were framed by graying hair, and his cold, calculating eyes locked onto Holmes with a gaze that was as sharp as any weapon. "You've been following me for quite some time, haven't you?" Thorne continued, his voice dripping with amusement. "I must admit, I'm impressed. Not many have the persistence to get this far." Holmes didn't reply immediately. Instead, he studied Thorne carefully, his mind working through the details of the case. He had suspected all along that Thorne was the mastermind behind Charles's disappearance. And now, here he was, as calm and composed as ever, sitting at his desk like a man who had nothing to fear. "I'm afraid, Mr. Thorne, that your game has come to an end," Holmes said finally, his voice firm. "We know about your dealings with Blackwood, and we know about the operation you've been running behind closed doors. Charles Pemberton discovered something he wasn't supposed to, and now he's gone. Margaret Kingsley is missing as well. Perhaps she found out too much." Thorne's smile remained, but his eyes darkened. "You've got it all wrong, Holmes. This isn't some simple business venture you've managed to uncover. What Charles discovered, what Margaret would have found, is far beyond your understanding. You should have stopped while you still could." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And what exactly is it that I don't understand, Mr. Thorne?" Thorne leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. "You're playing a dangerous game, Holmes. You've come too close to the truth, and now you've put yourself in a position where there's no turning back. But don't worry, I'll make sure your fate is sealed, just like Charles's." At that moment, the air between them seemed to crackle with tension. Holmes and Watson were standing at the precipice of something far darker than they had ever imagined. The final piece of the puzzle was within reach, but they had to be ready for whatever Thorne had planned next. The trap was set, and now it was a matter of who would make the first move. The silence in the room was deafening. Thorne's words hung in the air like a challenge, a dark promise that twisted the tension even tighter. Holmes stood motionless, his sharp gaze never leaving Thorne's face. Watson, though silent, could feel the palpable danger surrounding them, every second inching them closer to an unknown and potentially lethal conclusion. Thorne leaned back in his chair, his fingers still steepled, his expression a perfect mask of composure. "You think you've figured it all out, don't you, Holmes? That you're about to reveal some grand truth, but I'm afraid you're mistaken. What you've uncovered is just the surface. You're far from seeing the whole picture." Holmes didn't flinch, his gaze unwavering. "I don't need to see the whole picture, Thorne. I have enough to expose your game, your association with Blackwood, the missing persons, the dangerous dealings. Everything you've tried to bury is coming to light. Charles Pemberton and Margaret Kingsley are just pawns in a much larger scheme, and you've been pulling the strings." Thorne's eyes glinted with a cold, almost pitying amusement. "Pawns? No, Holmes. They were never pawns. They were complications, pieces that got in the way of something far more valuable than you'll ever understand. I have no use for them anymore." Watson took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. Every word Thorne spoke seemed to push the situation into even more dangerous territory. Charles Pemberton was dead. Of that, Watson was sure. The only remaining question was what part Blackwood and Thorne played in this dark game, and what role Margaret had, if any, in what had already happened. Holmes finally spoke, his voice even, but with the steely edge Watson had come to know all too well. "You're wrong, Thorne. Every piece is important, and you've underestimated us, thinking we wouldn't dig deep enough to find the truth. We know about your network, about the criminal enterprise you've built. Charles knew too much. That's why you had to silence him. And Margaret, she stumbled onto something that would have brought the whole thing crashing down, didn't she?" Thorne's expression shifted for just a moment, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly, his hand clenching around the armrest of his chair. It was a brief flicker, but Holmes caught it, and Watson did too. For the first time, Thorne's facade wavered, revealing a crack in his carefully constructed armor. "You think you've figured it out, Holmes?" Thorne's voice was cold now, sharper than before. "I should have known better than to underestimate your mind. But it's too late. You've wandered too far into the shadows, and now there's no way back." There was a moment of stillness, and then Holmes's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "If you think for 1 second that I will let you walk away from this, you're mistaken. The game is over, Thorne. We're taking you down." Thorne let out a dry laugh, the sound hollow and devoid of true amusement. He stood slowly, his movements controlled, like a man who had already made his peace with whatever was to come. "You still don't understand, do you, Holmes?" he said, his voice low and deliberate. "The truth you think you're chasing isn't what you want. It's too dangerous. And as for me, I've already prepared for this moment. You're playing right into my hands." Holmes's eyes flashed, but his calm demeanor remained intact. "You're not the one in control here, Thorne. Not anymore." The moment Thorne stepped forward, Holmes's hand moved instinctively to the pocket where his revolver rested. He had anticipated this, the inevitable showdown, the moment when words would no longer be enough. Watson followed suit, his own hand shifting toward his weapon. They were prepared, but this was no ordinary confrontation. This was the culmination of a tangled web of deception, and neither Holmes nor Watson could predict how it would end. Thorne's lips curled into a smile, but it was a smile devoid of warmth, one that made the air in the room feel colder still. "You think you're in control? But you're not. This has already been decided. You're just the last ones to figure it out. Margaret, Charles, they were just stepping stones. Do you really think this will end with me?" Holmes's eyes narrowed as he took a slow step forward, his mind racing. He had always trusted Holmes's instincts, but now the danger was palpable. Thorne had already shown how ruthless he was, and the last thing Watson wanted was for this confrontation to escalate into something even more dangerous. But he knew they had to advance. They had to expose Thorne for what he was and stop him before it was too late. Thorne's expression darkened, his earlier confidence now tinged with a hint of frustration. "You think you've won, don't you?" he said, his voice a low growl. "But the truth isn't what you think it is. And even if you do manage to take me down, there are forces at play here that you'll never be able to touch. You're out of your depth." Holmes didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Thorne's. "You may think you have power, but power without understanding is meaningless. You've created a network of lies, of deception, but all it takes is one truth to bring it all crashing down." "Is that what you think?" Thorne sneered. "One truth? You're a fool. The truth you're after is irrelevant. You've wasted your time chasing shadows. All you've done is expose a few small threads of a much larger tapestry. And now, well, now it's too late." Holmes's eyes narrowed, his mind working through the intricacies of the situation. He had known from the beginning that Thorne was dangerous, far more dangerous than anyone had initially realized. But there was something more here. Something that Thorne had been hiding, something Holmes had yet to uncover. The game wasn't over. Not yet. "You're wrong, Thorne," Holmes said, his voice sharp. "It's never too late to make things right, and we're not done yet. There's still one thing you haven't considered." Thorne tilted his head, a glimmer of curiosity flashing in his eyes. "And what's that?" "That I'm not alone," Holmes replied. He turned to Watson, his expression hardening. "Watson, if you would." Without a word, Watson reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a set of documents, the final piece of the puzzle. They were copies of correspondence between Blackwood, Thorne, and several other individuals tied to their criminal network. Letters that outlined not just the business dealings but the true extent of the operation, its scope, and its goals. Holmes held the documents for Thorne to see, his voice calm but filled with quiet satisfaction. "These documents, Mr. Thorne, are the final proof we need. They outline your dealings, your plans, and your network. You can't deny it now. Your empire of lies is exposed." Thorne's expression shifted, and for a brief moment his mask cracked. His eyes flared with panic, and for the first time there was a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. He knew right away that the game was up. But rather than show weakness, Thorne straightened up, his defiance returning. "Do you think this changes anything?" Thorne snarled. "You think these papers will save you? I'm beyond your reach, I've made sure of that." Holmes's face remained expressionless, but his eyes were hard. "You may think you've secured your future, but you've underestimated the consequences. The truth will come whether you like it or not. You can't escape it." Thorne's lips curled into a twisted smile. "We'll see about that." Before Holmes or Watson could react, Thorne moved swiftly, making for a nearby cabinet. He was faster than they anticipated, his movements sharp and calculated. But just as quickly, Holmes's hand shot out, grabbing Thorne by the arm and twisting it behind his back. The struggle was brief but fierce. Thorne's face contorted with rage, but Holmes's grip was unyielding. "Not so fast, Mr. Thorne," Holmes said, his voice cold. "You're not going anywhere." Thorne glared at Holmes, his defiance still burning in his eyes. "You may have won this round, Holmes, but I will make sure you regret this. There's always a price to pay for exposing the truth." Holmes's grip tightened as he pulled Thorne toward the door. "The price you'll pay is justice." As they left the warehouse, the fog swirling around them, Holmes knew it was far from over. The truth had been exposed, but the real consequences were yet to come. The cold mist of London's streets seemed to part for a brief moment as Holmes and Watson emerged from the darkened warehouse, Thorne in tow. The city, still blanketed in fog, appeared quieter than usual, as if the very air had absorbed the tension that had unfolded within the warehouse walls. Holmes, though victorious, maintained his usual air of composed detachment. His steps were steady, but Watson could sense that the case was far from over. They had exposed the truth, but what would the fallout be? And what remained to be uncovered about the missing Margaret Kingsley? Thorne, who had been silent since the brief confrontation, was now securely in their custody. His face had lost its earlier smugness, replaced by a quiet but intense defiance. He had not spoken since Holmes had revealed the incriminating documents, but his body language was enough to suggest that he was weighing his options, calculating his next move. Holmes, however, seemed unperturbed by Thorne's silence, the sharpness in his gaze unwavering. "Where are you taking him?" Watson asked, his voice low, breaking the silence between them. "To Scotland Yard," Holmes replied, his voice calm but with an edge of certainty. "It's time to ensure that the law catches up with him, Watson. Thorne may have had control over his operation, but now he will face the consequences of his actions." Watson nodded, his mind still processing the magnitude of what had just transpired. Thorne was a dangerous man, no doubt, but it was clear his plans had crumbled. With the documents in their possession, they now had enough evidence to bring down not only Thorne, but also Blackwood as well. But there was one more lingering question that gnawed at Watson's mind. Margaret. What had happened to her? Was she still alive, or had she become another victim of Thorne's ruthless games? "Holmes," Watson began, his voice carrying the weight of his concern. "What about Margaret? We know Thorne was behind her disappearance, but where is she? What has he done to her?" Holmes's expression softened for the briefest moment, but his resolve remained firm. "I believe Margaret is alive, Watson. Thorne may have had his hand in silencing Charles, but Margaret, she wasn't just complaining. I think she found something much more dangerous than Charles ever did. Thorne may have believed that keeping her hidden would ensure his success, but I doubt he would have killed her. Not yet, at least. No, she's likely being held somewhere. Somewhere he believes is safe. We must find her before he has a chance to disappear again." Watson felt a shiver run down his spine. The case was far from over, and the deeper they dug, the darker it became. There was still so much left to uncover, and with every passing hour, the pressure mounted. They arrived at Scotland Yard late into the night, where Thorne was immediately taken into custody. Holmes spoke briefly with officers, making sure the evidence was properly documented and Thorne would be held without bail. His demeanor remained calm, but there was a sharp edge to his actions. He knew that the true challenge was yet to come. They had their culprit, but they still lacked answers about Margaret's whereabouts. Thorne would not speak easily. Of that Holmes was certain, but even the most hardened criminals had their breaking points. Watson and Holmes entered an adjacent room to discuss their next steps. The only sound was the muffled hum of activity in the yard's hallways. Holmes sat down, his fingers steepled as he thought carefully about their next move. "We must focus on Thorne's associates," Holmes began, his voice low but clear. "He is too dangerous to have acted alone. The network that he and Blackwood have built is vast, and it's possible that others in this network are still at large. Margaret is likely hidden away, and I believe the key to finding her lies with one of Thorne's people. We need to apply pressure." Watson nodded, understanding the gravity of Holmes's words. They had no choice but to dig deeper. They couldn't afford to wait. Time was running out, and with each passing hour, the chances of finding Margaret alive dwindled. Holmes stood up suddenly, his expression hardened with resolve. "I'll return to Blackwood's estate. There's one person left to question, someone who may know more about Margaret's disappearance than they've let on. If Thorne won't speak, then perhaps we can learn something from Blackwood's associates. Watson, we need to move quickly." The fog had returned by the time they reached Blackwood's estate. The mansion loomed before them, its dark windows like the watchful eyes of a predator, waiting for its next move. Holmes and Watson made their way through the estate's long driveway, their footsteps muffled by the thick mist that had rolled in. The atmosphere was heavy with the promise of danger, and Holmes's face remained stoic, his mind already planning their next move. Once inside the mansion, Mrs. Ashford, the housekeeper, who seemed surprised to see them at such an hour, greeted them. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I wasn't expecting you," she said, her voice tinged with unease. "We're not here to discuss pleasantries, Mrs. Ashford," Holmes replied sharply. "We need to speak with one of Blackwood's associates, someone who may know where Margaret Kingsley is." Mrs. Ashford's eyes widened, and she hesitated before nodding. I don't know where she is, but there's a man, a contact of Mr. Blackwood's. He may know more. He's here often, but I've only seen him in passing. He's a tall man with dark hair. I believe his name is Gregory. He's the one you need to speak to." Holmes's eyes gleamed with the faintest hint of satisfaction. "Gregory, that's the lead we needed. Thank you, Mrs. Ashford. Now please, show us where we can find him." Mrs. Ashford led them through the mansion's labyrinthine hallways, her footsteps echoing in the silence. They reached a small sitting room where a man stood, his back to them, examining something on a table. He turned as they entered, his sharp features betraying no hint of surprise. Holmes wasted no time. "Gregory," he said, his voice steady and direct, "we need to know where Margaret Kingsley is. She's been taken, and we believe you know where she's being held." Gregory's face remained impassive, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a momentary hesitation. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. Holmes stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Gregory's face. "I think you do, and I think you're going to tell me before I force you to." Watson stood by, ready to intervene if necessary. The room seemed to close in on them as the silence stretched, each moment adding to the growing pressure. Gregory's eyes shifted, and for a moment, Holmes could see the uncertainty that had crept into his demeanor. "I'm not going to repeat myself, Gregory," Holmes said, his voice now tinged with menace. "Tell me where she is, or I will make sure that everything you've been hiding will be exposed." Gregory swallowed hard, his expression shifting, and in that moment, Holmes knew they were about to uncover the final piece of the puzzle. Gregory shifted uncomfortably under Holmes's piercing gaze, his fingers trembling ever so slightly as they gripped the edge of the table. Holmes had been methodical, patient, and relentless in his pursuit of the move fast. "We're getting you out, Margaret, but we need to leave now, before anyone realizes we're here." As they untied her, Holmes's mind raced. Blackwood and Thorne were still out there, still dangerous, and now they had a witness, someone who could expose everything. But even as he made plans for their escape, Holmes couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. There was more to this conspiracy than he had yet uncovered, and Blackwood would not give up so easily. With Margaret safe in their care, Holmes and Watson made their way back toward the hidden stairwell, knowing that the true battle was only just beginning. The journey back from Blackwood's estate felt like a race against time. The cold mist wrapped itself around Holmes, Watson, and Margaret as they hurried through the shadowed streets of London. Holmes led the way, his mind already planning their next move, but his sharp eyes never left their surroundings. Margaret, though alive, was still shaken by the ordeal she had endured. Her steps faltered at times, but Watson stayed close by, offering a steady hand to guide her. Holmes's mind was abuzz with the details of their findings. Blackwood had orchestrated this entire scheme, building an empire of lies, manipulation, and deception. But what was the goal? The criminal network he and Thorne had established had been vast, but it wasn't just money or power that had driven them. It had been something darker, something more insidious, and Margaret's disappearance had been the final piece in their twisted puzzle. "I don't know how to thank you," Margaret said softly, her voice still trembling. "I thought I would never see the light of day again." Holmes glanced at her, his expression softening for a brief moment. "You don't need to thank us, Margaret. You're safe now. That's all that matters." But Watson knew the fight wasn't over. They had exposed Thorne and Blackwood's involvement, but the truth of their operation was far from fully revealed. Margaret had been the key to unraveling it all, but there were still unanswered questions, questions that Holmes, as always, had yet to fully answer. As they made their way through the fog, Holmes suddenly stopped, his sharp eyes narrowing as he looked around. He had sensed something, a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle change in the air. Watson felt the tension in the air too, though he couldn't put a name to it. Holmes's instincts were rarely wrong. "What is it, Holmes?" Watson asked, his voice low, sensing something was wrong. Holmes's gaze flicked over the dimly lit streets, his mind calculating. "We're being followed." Watson's hand instinctively reached for his revolver. "Are you sure?" Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. "We must move quickly. Thorne and Blackwood may be down, but their network is far-reaching. Someone else is pulling the strings." Without another word, Holmes led them down a side alley, away from the main streets. The fog seemed to close in around them, obscuring their path, but Holmes moved with purpose, his every step carefully measured. They reached a small, inconspicuous door set into the side of a building, and Holmes pushed it open with a quiet click. The door creaked as they stepped inside, and the dim light from a single lantern flickered in the corner of the room. The moment they entered, Holmes's eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. Watson glanced around, noting the sparse furnishings, wooden chairs, a desk piled with papers, and a series of old portraits on the walls. There was something familiar about the room, but Watson couldn't quite place it. Holmes walked toward the desk, his fingers brushing over the scattered papers. He paused for a moment, examining them with great care. "I was right," Holmes murmured, his voice tinged with both satisfaction and a sense of foreboding. This was the real headquarters of Blackwood's operation. This is where it all started. Watson stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Holmes turned, his face grim. "This is where it all began." The documents here detail not just Blackwood and Thorne's criminal network, but also a series of political connections. People in high places, people who protected them, and people who turned a blind eye to everything they did. Blackwood wasn't just trying to maintain power, he was building a legacy. And that legacy involved not just money, but control over the very system that was meant to stop men like him. Watson felt a chill. So, it wasn't just a crime operation. It was a plot to subvert the very law itself. Holmes nodded, his eyes dark with realization. Exactly. This wasn't about wealth, this was about taking control, using manipulation, bribery, and intimidation to place themselves above the law. And now, with Thorne and Blackwood gone, their network will crumble. But there are others out there. Powerful others who may try to fill the void. Watson's mind raced. And Margaret? What will happen to her now? Holmes's expression softened as he turned to face her. Margaret is free, Watson, and that is all that matters. We've brought down the men who tried to control her, and now she can rebuild her life. But the true battle is not just in what we've uncovered. It's in ensuring that their legacy doesn't live on through others. Margaret, who had been silent for most of their time in the room, finally spoke. Her voice was shaky, but there was strength in it. What will happen to me now? Will they come after me again? Holmes gave a reassuring smile, though his eyes were still filled with thought. You'll be safe, Margaret. I'll make sure of it. They won't have the chance to hurt you again. But Watson could see the weight of the situation still pressing on Holmes's shoulders. The truth had been revealed, but it wasn't over. The criminals who had once ruled from the shadows were gone, but their influence lingered, and as much as Holmes had accomplished, there was still work to be done. We need to make sure this operation is completely dismantled, Holmes continued, his voice taking on an authoritative tone. I'll contact the authorities and have them comb through these documents, but for now, we must move quickly. Blackwood may be gone, but his allies remain. Holmes turned to leave, but before he could step out of the room, a voice called out from the shadows, "You won't get away with this." Holmes stopped, his hand instinctively reaching for his revolver. He turned, his eyes narrowing, as a figure stepped into the light. It was someone Watson didn't recognize. Tall, with dark hair and a sharp, angular face. He wore a long coat and carried himself with the kind of confidence that spoke of power, of someone used to getting what he wanted. "Who are you?" Holmes demanded, his voice low and measured. The man's smile was cold. "I'm someone who doesn't appreciate being outplayed, Holmes. You've destroyed a lot, but you've only scratched the surface. Blackwood's influence is far greater than you realize, and now you've made a powerful enemy." Holmes's expression hardened, his stance unyielding. "We'll see about that." With the final piece of the puzzle still shifting, Holmes knew this was just the beginning of the next chapter. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. The room was heavy with the weight of the moment, the final confrontation still fresh in their minds. Holmes stood still, his eyes never leaving the man who had appeared from the shadows, a cold smile playing across his lips. The challenge had shifted, but Holmes's composure remained unshaken. Watson, however, felt the unease settle deeper into his bones, the realization that the battle they had fought might only be the beginning. But despite the looming uncertainty, Holmes remained resolute, as always, in his quest for justice. The papers they had uncovered, the documents linking Blackwood, Thorne, and the criminal network, were now in the possession of Scotland Yard. There was no denying the weight of the evidence. The empire built on lies and manipulation would crumble, though it was clear that there were still remnants of that empire out there, waiting to pick up the pieces. The stranger's eyes gleamed with quiet menace, but Holmes didn't flinch. He didn't need to. The foundation of their success had already been laid. Thorne was in custody, Blackwood's operations were exposed, and Margaret was free. Holmes turned his attention to Margaret, who had remained quiet in the corner of the room, watching the exchange. The years of manipulation, of being silenced and hidden away, had taken a toll on her, but in that moment there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. The ordeal was over, for her at least. She had been through more than anyone should ever endure, and yet there was strength in her that could not be broken. "We'll make sure you're safe, Margaret," Holmes said, his voice softer now, more reassuring. "This is your chance to start over. You can live the life you deserve." Margaret's lips trembled as she nodded, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I never thought I'd see the day. I never thought I'd be free." As Holmes and Watson exchanged a brief glance, there was a sense of finality in the air. The pieces were in place. The truth had been revealed. The criminals who had orchestrated so much suffering were now about to face justice. But even in victory, Holmes remained focused. He knew the consequences of their actions were far-reaching. As they made their way toward the exit of the warehouse, Holmes turned back to the man who had appeared from the shadows, his words cold and calculated. "You can try to rebuild, but it won't last," Holmes said, his voice unwavering. "This network is finished, and so are you." The man's smile faltered, the momentary flicker of uncertainty in his eyes betraying the truth. But then he straightened, his posture shifting from defiance to cold calculation. "We'll see about that, Holmes," the man said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You've won this round, but the game is far from over, and when it comes back to you, you won't be prepared." With that, the figure disappeared into the shadows, leaving Holmes and Watson standing at the threshold. The lingering threat was palpable, but Holmes's focus was clear. The criminals who had once been untouchable were now being held accountable. And as for the future, well, that would be shaped by the consequences of their actions. The following days were filled with quiet satisfaction. Thorne and Blackwood's criminal empire slowly unraveled as Scotland Yard sifted through the evidence, arresting those who had been complicit in the operation. The truth about their dealings, about the manipulation, the lies, and the network they had built, became public knowledge, and the weight of their crimes finally caught up with them. As for Margaret, she found peace in a quiet corner of London, free from the shadows that had once haunted her. She slowly rebuilt her life, taking control of her own destiny after years of being silenced and controlled by the forces that had held her captive. Holmes and Watson kept in touch, offering her the support she needed, but ultimately, it was Margaret who determined her future. Holmes, as always, moved on to the next case, his mind always shifting, always calculating. Watson remained by his side, his partner in solving mysteries others could not. They had faced danger, uncovered secrets, and brought justice to the victims of a dark conspiracy. But even as they left behind the world of Blackwood and Thorne, the weight of the case lingered in their minds. The game is over, for now. But as Holmes had often said, the truth was like a shadow, always just out of reach. And in the quiet corners of London, there were always more mysteries waiting to be uncovered.